Hey, what's up, everybody? Hammerheart Metal Reviews here once again. Today, we are doing something completely different. We are going to be taking a trip back through time. I guess I've been feeling a little bit nostalgic, thinking back to my youth, to my early days. I've seen a few channels do things like this in the past, and I always kind of wanted to tackle it myself, but just hadn't got around to it. But basically what this video is going to be going through albums that I listened to in my very early days that kind of made me into who I am in terms of what kind of music I enjoy. So I'm going to kind of go from the time I was like 10 years old up till I was 17 or 18 and just kind of go through different bands and albums that shaped the music that I would eventually get into. Because I mean, to be honest, it's not like when you're 6 years old, you're out there listening to black metal. Like some people might say that, but I don't believe that for a second. I wasn't 5 years old listening to Bathory. That doesn't make sense. That would be frightening for a 5-year-old. So if people say they've been a metalhead since they were born, take that with a grain of salt. That's just not true. But I am going to kind of go through my formative years, albums that when I first started listening to music, what I listened to, and kind of how it slowly took shape into becoming the metalhead that I am today. So yeah, this is just to have a little bit of fun. I guess I've been feeling nostalgic. This video will date myself. I was born in 1984, so I did turn 40 earlier this year. So maybe I'm just thinking back to my youth, to my younger days when I had more energy and I wasn't this old man you see before you now. But nonetheless, I will say my early years, like in the 80s, I don't really remember much in terms of what music I was listening to. I feel like when you're that young, 5, 6 years old, you don't really retain the music that you're listening to. It would have only been around the time I was maybe turning 9 or 10 that I actually have memories of like seeking out and listening to music that I enjoyed. So I'm going to kind of start around there, around the time that I was 9 or 10 years old. So let's put that into around 1993. At that time, the music that I would be listening to would mostly be stuff on the radio. And if I did own anything, it would have been on cassette tape. The first cassette tape that I can ever at least remember in my mind of something that I owned and listened to was Alapalooza by Weird Al Yankovic. That's the kind of stuff I was into as a very small child. Just fun, making fun of other songs, parodies. For a kid, Weird Al was pretty great. Not something I listen to that much anymore, or ever for that matter. But that's at least my earliest memory of a cassette tape that I actually owned and listened to quite a bit. But as I grew up a little bit more, started to listen to more music on the radio, and the band that really caught my ear probably around the time I was 10 years old, give or take, of course, so we're talking like 1994, the band that I remember being my favorite band at that time was Aerosmith. I actually never owned an actual full length by them at that time. The cassette that I had was their greatest hits, and then I eventually got their second edition of their big greatest hits, big ones. Those two tapes were things that I listened to pretty nonstop. Could sing all the songs. Those were just like my favorite two cassette tapes that were nonstop in my Walkman. Those were just the things that I listened to nonstop. At that time, they were my favorite band. At that time, yeah, starting to get into more rock music. I kind of remember my dad showing me Van Halen. He knew that I was starting to get into like more serious music than things like Weird Al, and he showed me Van Halen, and that just blew me away. That's really what showed me that I'm really into guitar playing and hard rock music. The first tape that I had was 1984. It had songs like Panama and Hot for Teacher, and that stuff just blew my socks off. I was like, wow, Eddie Van Halen is a guitar god. Even at that young age, I understood what good guitar was, and that's kind of how I started to get into different kinds of music. But so it being only like 1994, maybe 1995 by this time, I'm 10 or 11 years old. Most of the music that's flooding the mainstream at that time is grunge. And of course, you'll get swept up into it because that's just what's getting pushed down your throat nonstop, whether it be on the radio, on TV. It's just, yeah, that's what was out there. And so, yeah, that's what I was into at that age. I had cassette tapes by Nirvana, Alice in Chains, Pearl Jam, Stone Temple Pilots. Collective Soul was one that I really enjoyed. But my actual favorite band at this time was a Canadian rock band called the Headstones. Maybe a little bit lesser known. Yeah, it's just straight ahead rock and roll, good old classic Canadian rock, but they had a little bit of a darker edge to them that appealed to me with some of their tongue-in-cheek like song titles and lyrics, and a lot of their stuff was about death. And it just, something spoke to me there that I knew I liked rock music, but I also liked some darker stuff. I liked horror movies. I liked things in that vein. And around this time, this is when I started buying CDs. They were starting to become more of a thing. I remember maybe, if any of you remember this, it was called Columbia House. It was like this program that you would join where you'd get, say, 10 CDs for a penny each, and then over the course of the next few years, you'd have to buy CDs at regular price. It seemed like a crazy good deal at the time. That's definitely how I built up my CD collection at the time to be way too many. Tons of CDs that I bought back then. I do not have anymore because I sold them many years ago. But yeah, one CD that really stood out in my memory that is probably one of the biggest, like most foundational CDs that sent me down the metal path in the future was actually not one that I had bought, but something my older brother had bought, and that was Paranoid by Black Sabbath. This was really a turning point in my life for sure. And it's pretty funny that my brother owned this CD and not me, if you know my brother, because he's like not a metalhead at all. It was just one that he bought because he was into at the time. But I honestly pretty much stole that CD from him. I listened to it way more than him. But yeah, that was the real game changer for me. After hearing Paranoid and just falling in love with it, that CD was what I listened to all the time. Then went down the rabbit hole of listening to other Sabbath and then getting into Ozzy's solo material as well. And then that was my favorite band at that time, was Ozzy and Black Sabbath. And that's just pretty much all I listened to at the time. That, yeah, just really kicked off my exploration into different styles of hard rock and metal. Got to think at this time as well, it's not like today where you can just go on YouTube or go find a streamer and listen to all this different stuff and get different recommendations. It was basically listening to the radio, watching TV. Up here in Canada, we had Much Music. The one day a week, they'd have this Much Loud where they'd show some heavier stuff. And of course, they'd air Beavis and Butthead from MTV, and sometimes they would show some videos. So that's kind of where you'd get some different bands. But stuff on the radio, once I started getting into heavier music, I mean, the radio didn't play a ton of like hard rock or metal either, but they started playing like the Black Album songs by Metallica, things like Enter Sandman and The Unforgiven, which even then I thought those were overplayed, but nonetheless, I bought the Black Album, started exploring their different, their earlier albums as well. The radio showed me a couple Megadeth songs, a couple Iron Maiden songs, so then you start exploring that way as well. And then, yeah, as I was going into junior high, so that would have been, I'm having trouble with the years here, but somewhere around when I was like 14 years old, so let's put that, probably even before that actually, I can't do math right now. Let's say 1997, I was probably 13 going into junior high, and the album that really changed everything for me was Far Beyond Driven by Pantera. This was kind of the first album that I had listened to that had like screaming vocals that was maybe a little bit heavier than anything else I had heard before, and I absolutely loved it. I just thought it was so heavy and super intense, which for a 13-year-old that hadn't really been exposed to heavier stuff yet, it makes sense. Like, yeah, all these albums I'm talking about today aren't necessarily things that I still hold the same opinion of that I did back then. But when I heard that, yeah, I got fully on board. I bought all the Pantera CDs to that point. I bought t-shirts. I bought hoodies. I was pretty much known as the guy that Pantera was his favorite band. It was kind of known as the metalhead at that point because of all the Pantera clothes that I was wearing. But yeah, throughout junior high, my favorite bands would have been Pantera, Alice in Chains, Ozzy and Sabbath still for sure. But then I also started to get into some more like modern bands of the day and age, like Tool with their album Enema. That one was a really big one for me in grade 7 or 8 or whenever it came out. Deftones Around the First, same thing. I really dug that at the time. And 9 Inch Nails, The Downward Spiral. That was another really big one for me in junior high. So that's kind of stuff I was listening to at that point. But then by the time 1998 rolled around, I started going into high school. I think that's the right year here. Yeah, 1998 would have been 14, 15, yeah. And started making friends with other metalheads, other like-minded individuals, and then that's where the exploration really the doors got blown open, you could say, that there was stuff that I had never even heard of that some of my friends were showing me. And likewise, I would show them some stuff, and it was just like a constant, let's discover some other music here. And wow, the stuff that I discovered in high school, some of it I still listen to a lot these days. But it started out not necessarily going into the more extreme genres, but it would have been more like traditional heavy metal like Judas Priest and Iron Maiden, really exploring their whole discography. And then obviously the bigger name thrash bands like Metallica, Megadeth, Slayer. Testament was a big one for me for sure. And then I started getting into power metal in grade 9 as well, with some of the first power metal bands that I checked out being Iced Earth and Blind Guardian, especially the Imaginations from the Other Side album by Blind Guardian. That one knocked my socks off, and to this day is probably my favorite album of all time. So that was, the first year of high school. Not necessarily getting to the more extreme stuff yet, but that would come in grade 10. Met a new fellow student that was even more into metal than I was at the time, and he showed me so much stuff, starting out with death metal, like showing me Cannibal Corpse's Gallery of Suicide and Death Leprosy. I was like, this is the most intense shit I have ever heard. And then he also showed me some more melodic stuff like Children of Bodom with Hatebreeder, Carcass with Heartwork, At the Gate, Slaughter of the Soul, and I was just fully hooked. I was completely into like melodic death metal at that point and just wanted to keep exploring and exploring. And then came black metal. But so you're thinking, it's 1998, there's a lot of black metal out there. The first black metal that I ever listened to is not something that's underground or cult. It is Dimmu Borgir with Enthroned Darkness Triumphant. I can clearly remember that being the first black metal that I ever heard, and I absolutely loved it at the time. I listened to that album non-stop, definitely one of the most played albums of my high school days for sure. And then from there, like, I got introduced to Immortal with At the Heart of Winter, would have came out around that same time, like I don't know, when I was in grade 10 or 11. And then that kind of just opened up the doors to exploring black metal and death metal. And I will say the one album and band that still sticks in my mind as something that was very world-changing for me was when my friend lent me Opeth, My Arms, Your Hearse. He had just got the CD a few months before, and he's like, check this out, lent it to me, and I honestly had never heard anything like it. I didn't even know how to describe it. I'm like, what is this? Like, this was before the time of knowing all these different subgenres or how everything was labeled, or at least for me in high school, I didn't really understand what progressive death metal was. It's just like, is this death metal? But there's acoustic parts. It's very strange, but I absolutely love it. I want to hear more stuff like this. And the exploration just went on and on and on from there. It just kind of opened my mind to exploring even deeper, finding more bands all the time. And that's been going on since that day, since those times. So yeah, this would have been around like 2001 at this point. I would have been like 17. That's when I joined my first band. So you can see from the picture over here, this is, circa 2001, I think, ended 2001. That's me in the middle there with the Exhumed shirt. I was the vocalist when I was 17 years old. This band didn't necessarily last too long, but joined a few bands over the years. And yeah, it's just been a non-stop exploration of finding more music, finding more underground stuff. Obviously, when you're in high school, you're not necessarily exploring all the underground because you're just getting exposed to it. But I just thought it would be fun to kind of reminisce and think about the old days and kind of let you know the gateway albums that got me into what I listen to these days. It's just been a never-ending cycle of searching, finding more stuff I love. And that's basically what this channel is all about too, showcasing and talking about albums that I love, that I discover along the way, and getting recommendations from you. But I just thought this would be a little fun to do. If you have a channel, feel free to kind of do one of these yourself, do a response video. I would definitely check it out, or just in the comments down below. Give me some of your gateway albums that maybe you weren't a metalhead before, but then you started listening to these like in your youth, in your teenage years, and then that kind of opened the floodgates for you, if you will, into exploring other albums and just diving in and becoming a full-out metalhead. But this is just to have some fun, reminisce, feeling nostalgic today. That's it, though. Until next time, Hammer Heart Metal Reviews. Out.